All right, now we're going to move to the next step, which is creating a unique activation code, which will allow us to make sure the user owns the email address they have provided. Okay, but before we move ahead, let's just have a look at our code and rectify a couple of things. So we've got a $sign missing from our results variable there. Okay, and we've got the same thing in the previous lines right there. Okay, and also we actually don't need the quotes for the table name in the query. Okay, now let's just save our code and refresh the page and just try with an empty form and make sure we don't get any errors. Okay, we do get the right error messages in there. Okay, now let's just provide a username and see what we get. Okay, and let's just provide an email address. Okay, it looks good. Okay, now before we move to the next step, just a quick comment. Sometimes you might need to do some debugging with your code, especially if you have an error relating to your query. So let's change our query and just have the wrong table name. Okay, so if we save and then refresh our code and try again with an empty form. Okay, now we get error running the query, which is this query. Okay, but we don't know what the error is. So there is a function called MySQLi error, which is going to return the error corresponding to the last executed query. So let's add one more line just before the exit function. Okay, so we're gonna use this function called MySQLi error. So it's going to take one parameter, which is going to be our link variable where we store the connection. So let's save and refresh our code, our page. So now we can see the error corresponding to the query. Okay, so it's telling us that the table does not exist. Okay, and that's exactly what we were expecting as we change the table name, right? So that's something to keep in mind to do some debugging. Okay, so for now, I'm going to comment this line. Okay, and then rectify the table name, then save and refresh our code and make sure that things are still working. Perfect. All right, now let's create our unique activation code. To do this, we're going to need to use a function that can generate random numbers. But we need something really strong, using some strong algorithms to generate these random numbers. The function we're going to be using here is called OpenSSL random pseudo bytes. So this function will generate a pseudo random string of bytes. Okay, so what's a byte? So a byte, which we spell like this, okay, is a unit of data, which is 8 binary digits long. Okay, so let's just write this, a unit of data, which is 8 binary digits long, which is 8 bits. So what's a bit? So a bit is the smallest unit of data, okay, for the computer. So that's where the computer is going to store either 0 or 1. So that's what 1 bit is, okay? So 1 bit is 0 or 1. So our function is going to take a couple of parameters. So the first one is going to be how many bytes, okay, we would like to generate. So let's go for 16 bytes. And then the second parameter, okay, is optional. And if you put a variable in there, it's going to be, okay, the function is going to store in that variable a boolean, either false or true. So it's going to be true if the algorithm, okay, used for the function is assessed to be strong. Okay, so very often that variable is going to be true, okay, it's very rare that we get a false value for that variable. Okay, so we're gonna use only the first parameter for now. Okay, so we're gonna store the output of our function inside a variable that we're gonna call activation key. Okay. Now we need to know how many characters we're going to allocate for this variable, okay, inside our users table. Okay, so we say we're going to be using 16 bytes. Okay, so each byte is 8 bits. So 16 bytes is going to give us 16 multiplied by 8. Okay, and that's going to be 128 bits. Okay, to understand this clearly, okay, you can imagine that for each bit, okay, we've got two values. Okay, so the first bit is going to be two values, either 0, 1. The second one is going to be 2, either 0, 1, and so on. Okay, so if you represent a number in this format, okay, this is what we call base 2. Okay, so when we store the value of our activation key in the table users, we're going to store that in hexadecimal. So you're going to need to convert this base 2 to base 16. So base 16, okay, corresponds to 2 multiplied by 2 4 times, and that's what's going to give us 16. Okay, so for 128 bits in this formula, you'll find 128 2s. Okay, but if we go for 16 multiplied by 16, etc., okay, for this same formula, that's going to give us how many times 16? That's going to be 128 divided by 4. Okay, so that's going to be 32. So actually we're going to need 32 characters for our activation key in the users table. Okay, so since we're going to be storing this variable in hexadecimal, we're going to need to convert it from binary to hexadecimal. And there is a very useful function for this. It's called binary to hexadecimal. Okay, just like this. All right, so now let's have a look at our table and make sure that you've got 32 characters allocated for the activation key in the users table. So you can see that the activation field has got 32 characters allocated already, so we don't have to change anything. Okay. Now let's insert the user details with the activation code in the users table. So to do this, we're going to create a query first, okay, and we're going to store it in a variable that we're going to call SQL. So the query is going to insert a whole line or a record in the table. So the syntax is insert into the table name, which is users, and then we're going to have parentheses where we're going to place the names of our columns, okay, or the affected columns, and then we're going to have values followed again by parentheses where we're going to place all the corresponding values for each of those columns. So the columns are going to be as following. So we're going to have the username, okay, then the email, then the password, okay, and finally we need the activation key as well, and that's activation. All right, now the corresponding values are going to be the username variable. Okay, so we're going to need to place these in the same order as the order of the columns. Email, password, okay, and then the activation key. Okay, and just make sure that you place each of these inside single quotes like that. Okay. Now to run the query, we're gonna use the function MySQLi query, okay, which will take a couple of parameters. So the first one is the link variable, okay, and the second one is the query itself. So we're going to store the outputs of this function inside a variable, okay, that we're going to call results. So that's going to be an object, all right. So if the query is successful, that's going to be an object. Otherwise, it's going to return false, okay. Now we're going to check if the query is not successful, okay. So if it's not successful, that's going to return false. So the opposite is going to be true, okay. So we're going to check the opposite of results. So if that's the case, we're going to echo an error message, okay. So let's just copy that one to save time. Okay, and let's say something like there was an error inserting the user details in the database. Okay. And then we're going to exit the whole PHP code. All right. If you want to use the else statements, you can do that. I'm going to go for the exit function for now. Now let's send an email to the user to make sure that they own the email address they have provided. Okay. So we're going to use the mail PHP function. Okay. So it's going to take a few parameters. So the first one is going to be the email where we're sending the email, and that's going to be our email variable. Then we're going to have the subjects of the email. So let's say confirm your registration. Then we're going to have the body of our email, and let's call that message for now. So we're going to store inside this variable the body of the email, and then we're going to have another parameter that's going to be from which email the message is coming from. Okay, so you can choose any email address for this. So I'm going to go for developmentisland@gmail.com. Okay, so now let's build our message variable just before the mail function. So it starts like this. Please click on this link to activate your account. So basically, we're going to have a link that we're going to be sending to our user, and the link is going to direct them to the activate.php file. Okay, so let's have a line return and again, and let's add the link to the variable. Okay, so just a reminder. Okay, so if you're building a real project where users are going to be signing up and logging in, you will need to purchase an SSL certificate, okay, so that you can have a secure connection and make sure that anything that's exchanged between your users and your server is done in a secure way. Okay, so for now I'm using a subdomain, so that's why it's not possible to have an SSL connection, but if you're doing a real one, you will need that. Okay, so that's going to be activate.php, and if you remember, the activate.php file is going to receive a couple of parameters. Okay, so it's going to receive an email and an activation key, and those are going to be get parameters. Okay, so let's add these to the link. Okay, so we're going to have a question mark, and then the first parameter is going to be email. Okay, and then we're going to need the equal sign, and then the value of the email. So for emails, if you place them inside a URL, you would need to encode the email for the URL formats. And for this, rather than placing the email like this, okay, we're going to need to use a function that will encode the email for the URL. Okay, so that function is called URL encode. Okay. All right. And then we're gonna add the key parameter. So that's ampersand key equal activation key. Now let's have a look at the mail function. So if the email is sent successfully, the function is going to return true. So in all cases, it's going to return a Boolean, true if the email is sent successfully, false if not. So what we're going to do, we're going actually to check the output of this function. So if mail, okay, we're going to echo a success message, okay. Okay, and let's say thank you for registering. Confirmation email has been sent to the email address provided. Okay. Then please click on the activation link to activate your account. All right, in order to include the variable email like that, we'll need double quotes instead of single quotes. Also, we'll need to change the inside double quotes to single quotes like this. Okay. All right. Now let's have a look at the password. So when you store the password in the user table, we shouldn't be storing the password in plain text. We'll need to hash our password. Okay. So when we were preparing the variables for the queries, okay, so there was an extra step that we needed for the password, and that's hashing the password. So we're going to replace the password variable with the hashed version of the password. So we're going to use a hashing function. So there are many functions you can use. There is MD5, okay? It's not the strongest hashing function, but we can start with this function for now. So the MD5 function is going to use a hashing algorithm to hash our password. So the output of this function is going to be 128 bits long, okay, but it's going to be stored in hexadecimal automatically, so that's going to give us 32 characters. Okay, so let's have a quick look at our table and make sure that we've got 32 characters allocated for the password. So we're going to need to change the structure for the password field. So that needs 32 characters. So we're going to come back later to this field when we use another hashing function. But for now, let's start with the MD5. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit and explain why we're not going to rely on the MD5. Okay.